The propeller clawed at air that felt more like glass than wind. At 20 below, metal still behaved like metal. At 40 below, it began to feel brittle. At 50 below, it stopped feeling like anything at all. Just a silent agreement that mistakes would be final. The fighter's engine was running, but not happily. The oil pressure needle trembled at the edge of the green, as if it could not decide whether it had the strength to stay there. Ahead was an empty white horizon. No trees, no road, no smoke column, no helpful curve of a river. Only the faint smear of sky and snow blended into a single sheet. The pilot could not see the ground well enough to judge distance, and he could not trust the compass because this far north the needle lied, dragged by unseen forces. His map showed an airfield that should have been there, somewhere beyond the next 150 miles of nothing. His radio gave him only hiss. He was alone in a brand-new American aircraft, marked with Soviet stars, carrying a war across a continent. One more minute without a landmark, one more minute of the engine cooling the wrong way, and he would have to decide whether to land on a frozen river he could not truly see or keep flying into the blank until the machine chose for him. He had been told this route was safe. That was the first lie the Arctic ever told. This moment unfolded in the winter of 1943, on the long ferry chain that ran from Alaska into Siberia and then deep into the Soviet interior. At the center of it was a place that did not look like the center of anything. Ladd Field, outside Fairbanks, where American mechanics and Soviet inspectors met under tight rules, and where thousands of American aircraft were quietly passed, hand to hand. The story was not about a single ace or a single dogfight. It was about how an Air Force starving for machines was fed by a sky road that killed men without firing a shot, and how that road helped Stalin's air arm stand up again plane by plane, engine by engine, through weather that made the enemy almost irrelevant. The world remembers convoys and famous battles. It rarely remembers the invisible bridge of air that made many of those battles possible. To understand why a pilot would gamble his life over a white void, it had to begin far from Fairbanks, far from Yakutsk, far from the Bering Strait. It began in 1941, when the German invasion ripped open the Soviet front and consumed aircraft faster than factories could replace them. Pilots fought until their regiments were hollow. Airfields burned, mechanics worked in mud and snow with parts that did not exist. The Soviet Union demanded help, and the United States offered Lend-Lease aircraft, trucks, fuel, aluminum, radios, tools, an industrial flood aimed at a bleeding front. But supply was not a promise. Supply was a route. The obvious route across the Atlantic was dangerous and slow. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk were hammered by submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders. The Persian corridor through Iran carried immense tonnage, but it took time to expand, and it did not deliver fighters ready to fly into combat. There was another path, colder and stranger. Fly the aircraft themselves, across North America, through Canada, into Alaska, then over the top of the world into Siberia. An aerial pipeline that could move planes with their wings attached. It sounded almost clean compared to a convoy under torpedo attack. It was not clean. It was simply a different kind of deadly. The Americans already had the bones of an air route to Alaska. Before the war, airfields and weather reporting stations had been pushed north in pieces. And once the United States entered the conflict, that northern infrastructure expanded fast. The Aleutian Campaign made Alaska an active theater, and every new runway mattered. By 1942, the Northwest staging route could take ferry pilots from the continental United States up through Canada into the Alaskan interior. Fairbanks, with Ladd Field, became a hub because it had what the North rarely offered: a stable base, maintenance capacity, and space to receive aircraft in volume. On paper, the transfer to Soviet crews looked simple. In reality, it was a controlled collision between two militaries that trusted each other only as far as the war required. The first aircraft sets came through when the machinery of the route was still finding its rhythm. In early September 1942, the first small group of Douglas A-20 Havocs left Great Falls, Montana, and reached Alaska within days, a proof that the system could work before it truly existed. The planes were not glamorous. They were light bombers, useful, rugged, practical tools for a war that ate practical tools by the thousand. They were also the opening of a gate that would not close until the war ended. At Fairbanks, the handover process began with inspection. The Soviet side demanded acceptance standards that felt harsh to American crews who had just flown the aircraft thousands of miles. But harsh standards were the language of survival on the Eastern Front. Every plane that arrived in the Soviet Union would eventually be pushed hard by pilots who had no patience for defects that could kill them on takeoff or during a low-level attack run. The Americans called repaired issues squawks. The Soviets treated them as things that got men buried. The scene at Ladd Field was both cooperative and tense. Rows of aircraft sat in the cold. Bell fighters with tricycle landing gear, twin-engine bombers that looked enormous compared to Soviet single-engine machines, transports built to swallow cargo and deliver it where rail lines ended. American ground crews wore layered parkas and moved with the practiced hurry of men who knew that exposed skin could be punished in minutes. Soviet pilots arrived in groups, many with flight suits padded and stiff, faces rubbed raw by cold and wind. They did not come as tourists. They came as ferrymen collecting the war. A young Soviet lieutenant might walk around a brand-new Bell P-39 Airacobra with the careful attention of a man inspecting a horse that would carry him into fire. The aircraft looked different from the fighters he had known. The engine sat behind the pilot, the nose held a cannon, and the landing gear placed the aircraft on 3 points like a modern machine rather than a tail-dragger. It was American engineering, but it was about to become Soviet muscle. He would sign papers he could barely read, listen to instructions in a language he did not speak, then climb into the cockpit and take off into a corridor of wilderness that allowed no mistakes. The first legs westward from Fairbanks were deceptively simple on a map and brutally complicated in the air. The fighter groups did not fly alone. Single-engine fighters often moved in clusters, escorted and shepherded by multi-engine aircraft that could carry extra navigation gear and radios, because losing a lone single-seat fighter over the tundra meant losing the pilot with it. The route pointed to Nome, a name that sounded like a joke until it became a lifeline. Nome was not Moscow. Nome was a coastal outpost balanced between sea and emptiness, a place where the runway existed because it had to. From there came the hardest psychological step, the crossing to Siberia, leaving a world of American fuels and spare parts and rescue capacity for a world where rescue might mean a dog sled or nothing at all. In those early months, everything that could go wrong learned to go wrong quickly. Engines that ran smoothly in warmer air began to behave unpredictably when temperature dropped and oil thickened. Carburetors iced, hydraulics slowed, canopies frosted at the edges until the pilot felt like he was peering through a narrowing tunnel. A simple navigation error could not be corrected by turning toward a highway or a city. It could only be corrected by luck and fuel. Pilots learned to read the landscape like a map drawn in snow, if the snow allowed any features to be seen. One of the first lessons was that the route's enemy was not always the sky. Sometimes it was the ground crew's fight. In Siberia, airfields had to exist in places where no airfields had ever been needed. strung through territory so vast that distances felt like jokes. Soviet engineers and laborers carved runways out of permafrost and swamp, building in summer mud and winter iron. They brought in fuel in drums and stored it like treasure. They created meteorological stations because a report from a lonely hut could mean the difference between a landing and a tomb. For every pilot who flew the route, dozens worked in silence to make sure there was a place to land. When those workers failed, not from incompetence, but from impossible conditions, the sky punished the pilot for it. By late 1942 and into 1943, a specialized Soviet organization took shape to make the ferrying systematic. Designated regiments responsible for specific segments, each learning its stretch of wilderness until it felt almost knowable. Fairbanks to Nome, Nome to the first Soviet airfields beyond the Bering Strait, then onward through places whose names sounded like the ends of the earth: Welkal, Sayamchan, Yakutsk, Kerensk, Krasnoyarsk. The chain worked because each link was made responsible for a link length of survival. A pilot who knew the weather tricks near Yakutsk might not be the same pilot who could read the mountains and coastal fog near Nome. The Arctic demanded local knowledge, and the system tried to manufacture it. Still, knowledge did not stop storms. An action report might read like a simple line: forced landing, engine failure. But behind that line could be hours of decision-making so tense the pilot felt it in his teeth. A fighter losing oil pressure over a frozen river had choices that were not choices. He could attempt to reach an airfield he could not see through blowing snow, risking a dead engine at altitude and a crash into forest. Or he could put the aircraft down on the ice, trusting that it would hold, and that the landing gear would not dig in and flip the machine, and then trust even more that someone would find him before frostbite did what bullets did not. The pilot in that winter sky, watching the oil pressure needle tremble, was living one of those reports in real time. The aircraft was likely a P-39 because so many were. The Airacobra became one of the most common fighters on the route, and later one of the most familiar American silhouettes over the Eastern Front. Its Allison engine did not give it the high-altitude performance that Western pilots often wanted, but the Soviet air war was frequently fought lower, where ground attack and short, brutal engagements mattered. The P-39's heavy nose gun and concentrated forward fire fit that environment. It was not a romantic machine, it was a weapon, and weapons were what mattered. He searched the whiteness for something darker than snow: a river line, a patch of forest, the shadow of a ridge, anything that could tell him where he was. When he finally saw it, it was not a runway. It was a bend of a frozen river, smoother than the surrounding terrain, a strip of ice that might accept a landing under just the right angle, if the wind did not push him sideways at the last second. He eased the fighter down, hands light on the controls, watching the airspeed like a man watching his own pulse. The wheels kissed the ice, bounced once, then settled. The aircraft rolled, skated, threatened to weather vane, then straightened. He let the nose come down carefully, praying that the tricycle gear would not collapse under the cold, stiffened shock strut. When he finally stopped, the engine coughed and died as if it had been waiting for permission to quit. The silence that followed was heavier than the engine noise had been. He climbed out into air that cut his lungs and looked around at a world that did not care whether he lived. He thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. Survival on the Altai route often began after the landing. In Siberia, distance was its own enemy. A downed pilot could be a day away from a weather station by foot, and that foot journey could be a sentence. Rescues happened not because the wilderness was kind, but because the route created a thin web of human presence across it. A radio hut here, a fuel cache there, a search aircraft launched when weather allowed. Locals who understood how to move in a landscape that killed outsiders. Sometimes a pilot was found because he had enough training to stay with the aircraft, to build shelter beside it, to conserve strength. Sometimes he was found because someone else decided to risk their own life in the same weather to search. The air bridge did not run on aluminum alone. It ran on the willingness of people to go out into hell to pull someone back. Back at Ladfield, the line of aircraft never stopped for long. That was another way the story stayed hidden. There was no single dramatic moment everyone could point to. It was repetition. The slow, relentless movement of machines. The Americans ferried aircraft north through Canada. They handed them to Soviet crews. The Soviets ferried them west across Siberia. And then, somewhere beyond Krasnoyarsk, the aircraft were distributed again, sent to training centers, then to units, then to the front. The transformation from crate fresh airplane to combat veteran happened far beyond Alaska. But Alaska was where the chain began. As the months passed, the scale increased, and the variety of aircraft became a moving catalog of American production. The A-20 Havoc became a familiar twin-engine shape, valued for low-level strikes and night missions. The North American B-25 Mitchell, heavier and longer-legged, came through as well, destined for Soviet bomber units that would use it in roles from tactical strikes to maritime work. The Douglas C-47, the plane transport that never received proper admiration, became one of the most important machines of all, because a war was not won only by the aircraft that shot down other aircraft. It was won by the aircraft that moved engines, mechanics, radios, wounded soldiers, and fuel to places that would otherwise be empty. Every type brought its own risks on the route. Multi-engine aircraft could continue on one engine, but that did not mean they could climb over mountains or clear weather. Fighters were nimble, but they offered no place to sleep, no room for extra gear, no second crew member to help with navigation when fatigue made the mind slow. The Siberia Air Bridge demanded endurance from men flying machines they had not designed, on instruments they sometimes did not fully trust, in conditions that made instrument flying mandatory. The weather did not allow heroism in the usual sense. It allowed discipline. It allowed the refusal to panic when the horizon disappeared. And even when an aircraft made it safely to the Soviet interior, another stage waited. The pilots who delivered many of these aircraft were not always the pilots who would fight in them. Ferry pilots were a separate breed, asked to fly the same dangerous leg again and again without the satisfaction of combat victory. Their enemy was the sudden fog at low altitude, the crosswind on an icy runway, the engine that started reluctantly after a night at -40, the radio beacon that failed, the fuel that gelled. In a cruel sense, they were sometimes at war with physics more than with Germany. Yet the bridge mattered because the Eastern Front consumed aircraft at an astonishing pace. When the imported fighters and bombers finally reached operational units, they did not arrive as symbols. They arrived as replacements for losses, as extra squadrons, as the margin between having a patrol in the air and being blind. In 1943, when Soviet forces and the Luftwaffe bled each other over the Kuban and the long arc of the front, American fighters began to appear in Soviet hands more and more often. German pilots learned new silhouettes. Ground troops heard different engine notes. It was not that a single imported aircraft changed the war by itself. It was that thousands of them changed the Soviet Union's ability to keep fighting without pause. The Bell fighters became part of that change. The P-39 Era Cobra, and later the P-63 King Cobra, were often fought at altitudes where the Soviet air war lived. a pilot could dive to speed, use concentrated forward fire, and break away low, using a tactic that valued acceleration and firepower rather than sustained high-altitude maneuvering. The aircraft's quirks remained, and the Soviets learned them the hard way. Mismanagement of fuel distribution could make the aircraft unstable. A careless pilot could push the machine into a spin that was difficult to recover. It demanded respect. On the Eastern Front, respect for a machine was another word for staying alive. Meanwhile, the bridge kept feeding the machine hunger behind the lines. Each delivery meant not only a plane, but also a chain of parts and procedures. American radios and instruments introduced differences that Soviet mechanics had to master. Training had to adapt. Documentation had to be translated or learned by repetition. Ground crews became bilingual in the language that mattered most. What broke? What could be patched? What needed replacement? In a war of exhaustion, logistics was not a background story. It was the story. One of the most quietly dramatic places on the route was the acceptance line itself. An aircraft would arrive at Ladd Field flown by an American ferry pilot who had spent days moving it north through Canada. The machine would be shut down and walked through inspection. Defects would be listed. Americans would fix them, sometimes cursing inside mittens because the cold made simple tasks miserable. Then the Soviet side would test and accept. A signature, a stamp, a nod, and the aircraft became a Soviet weapon. That handover happened thousands of times. It was a ritual performed for war, and it had to be controlled. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was real, but it was never intimate. Security rules kept contact limited. There were cultural exchanges in small moments, an offered cigarette, a quick smile when a shared joke broke through language. But the larger atmosphere remained one of guarded cooperation. The planes mattered more than the friendship. Everyone could feel that the war was forcing nations together that might not remain together once the common enemy was beaten. That tension added another kind of secrecy to Alsib. Not just secrecy from Germany, but secrecy from history, which prefers clean narratives over complicated alliances. By the time the route reached full scale, it became one of the most productive aircraft delivery pipelines of the war. Nearly 8,000 aircraft were transferred through the Alaska staging point to Soviet crews between 1942 and 1945. A number so large, it sounded abstract until one imagined the physical reality. Thousands of engines started in bitter cold, thousands of takeoffs into featureless sky, thousands of landings on runways carved from wilderness. The route's cargo was not only machines, it was time. It shortened the delay between American production lines and Soviet airfields, turning factory output into frontline presence. The costs were paid in accidents, forced landings, and lost crews. The environment collected its share steadily. When an aircraft disappeared between stations, search parties might wait days for weather to allow a flight, and then fly patterns over a landscape that could hide wreckage forever. Sometimes, a crash site was discovered years later. Half swallowed by forest or snow, the aircraft's shape preserved by cold like a relic. The pilots who died on ALSIAB were not killed by an enemy ace. They were killed by the simple fact that a war demanded a corridor through some of the harshest airspace on Earth, and nature demanded payment. Yet the bridge held. It held because both sides pushed it to hold. American personnel kept the northern staging fields functioning, and Soviet ferry regiments kept the Siberian links alive. Meteorologists watched pressure changes like prophets. Mechanics learned to work fast with numb fingers. Pilots learned to trust instruments when the world outside became unreadable. And all the while, German intelligence could not easily bomb or sabotage what it could barely see, and could not reach. Near the end of the war, the story gained one last twist. The aircraft moving across Elbe were built to fight Germany, but the geopolitical clock was also turning. As 1945 approached, the Soviet Union prepared to enter the war against Japan, and aircraft delivery routes into the Far East took on additional meaning. The bridge that had fed Stalin's Air Force for the fight in the West also strengthened the Soviet ability to project air power across its vast eastern territories at the war's conclusion. A route designed under one strategic emergency became useful in another. History often worked that way. When the pipeline finally slowed and then stopped in 1945, it did not end with a parade. It ended with paperwork, with the last aircraft accepted and flown onward, with Soviet crews leaving Alaska as the alliance cooled into a different era. The runways remained. Some became part of post-war aviation networks. Some faded back into quiet. But the achievement stayed enormous in its own understated way. An industrial power built machines. An embattled power needed them. And between them stretched a sky road across Canada, Alaska, the Bering Strait, and Siberia, a road that ran not on asphalt, but on courage controlled by procedure. The pilot who had landed on the frozen river did not know, in that moment of silence beside his dead engine, what his aircraft would mean later. He did not know the statistics. He did not know how historians would count shipments, list aircraft types, and debate which route carried the most. He knew only the immediate truth, that a single aircraft on this route was never just a single aircraft. It was the promise of another patrol over the front, another strike mission, another transport flight carrying parts to a unit that could not fight without them. It was one more lever pulled against Germany's advantage in 1941, one more piece of leverage handed to a country that refused to be crushed. That was the real secret of the Alaska-Siberia Air Bridge. It did not win the war with a single spectacular raid. It won by refusing to break. It turned wilderness into a corridor and cold into an obstacle that could be managed rather than feared. It transformed a distant outpost near Fairbanks into a hinge of history. Aircraft after aircraft disappeared west into Siberia and then reappeared months later as silhouettes over the eastern front, flown by men who never saw Lad Field and never knew the names of the mechanics who kept their machines alive. When those pilots pulled the trigger in combat, the sound began far earlier on a remote runway in Alaska, in the first cough of an engine starting in the cold, and in the quiet determination of everyone who kept that invisible bridge open.